go ahead and be turning to 1 Peter chapter 3, of chapter 4 rather, 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of 1 Peter here this morning, 1 Peter chapter 4. Before we get into chapter 4, as we've been doing with all the chapters, we want to spend just a moment reviewing what we've seen so far in the book of 1 Peter. And so, in just a second, and then get into chapter 4. The book of 1 Peter is about being holy. Give me just a minute here. Some of our stuff up here controlling it went out. There we go. The book of 1 Peter is about be holy. The key verse to the book is found in chapter 1 and in verses 15 and 16. But as you also be holy in all your conduct, as it is written, be holy, for I am holy. And so I'll outline that general about being holy. So we've got the call to be holy in chapter 1. We've got living as holy in chapter 2 through the first part of chapter 3. Suffering for being holy, chapter 3:13 through 4:19, and then exhortations to the holy in chapter 5. We're in section 3. But before we get into finishing section 3 this morning, section 1, the call to be holy. So as you go through chapter 1, he tells us that God has called us to be holy, and he explains the reasons we need to be holy in chapter 1. You recall in 1 Peter chapter 1, he told us, verses 1 and 2, that we are the elect according to the foreknowledge of God, that we are begotten 3 to 12 to a living hope, that we are to be holy as God is holy in 13 to 17, that we were born twice, 18 to 21, that we're born again by the word of God in 22 to 25. That's why you need to be holy. Chapter 2 then, in the first part of chapter 3, you're living as holy. That is, how does this really look in our everyday walks of life? And so you need to lay aside sin and desire the word in 1 to 3 of chapter 2. About the privileges of being holy in 4 to 10, and then some duties of the holy in 11 to 25. He talks about the duty of sojourners and pilgrims, the duty to submit to government, our duties towards others, and the duties of servants towards masters. Chapter 3 then is more duties of holiness and suffering for righteousness' sake. And so 1 to 6, duties in the home. 1 to 7, duties in the home. 1 to 6, here's what wives need to be. Verse 7, husbands. Duties towards each other in 8 to 12. And in 13 through 22, as we start the section on suffering, but still really a duty that we have is our duties when we face suffering. We're still in the section on suffering for being holy. We're in chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. But before we get into chapter 4, verse 1, let's go through a couple of our questions here. Question number 1, briefly summarize the chapter. Now, again, as I said, the next question is about the main theme, but as we summarize the chapter, you're just telling in 2 or 3 sentences, 1, 2, 3 sentences, what exactly is in this chapter? What's the content of the chapter? What are we dealing with?
We'll be living as God's people, the hope that we have.
Living in God's people and the hope that we have. What else is dealt with in this chapter? Suffering. I think when we look at the chapter, and I'll get to this more in a second. Let's go ahead and ask the theme, and then I'll come back with the summary. What's the main theme of the chapter? Now, you can come up with a number of things. I've heard a number of different themes. But what seems to be the main thing we're tying back to in this chapter?
How to be holy in any situation.
How to be holy in any situation. The title I give to the chapter here, going along that line, is Living as a Christian. So which still is, if you're living as a Christian, you're living as holy. So when we get into this chapter here in a minute, you put away your past life. He talks about how you live right in light of the end of all things. And then he talks about suffering as a Christian.
And by the way, the reason we use living as a Christian for this chapter is one of only 3 chapters to actually contain the word Christian in all the Bible. We'll see that in verse 16. It's found in Acts 11. The disciples are first called Christians. It's found in Acts chapter 26. Almost you persuade me to become a Christian. And so that's why we use that title. But again, living as a Christian, or we're living as holy. How does that look in our everyday walks of life? Question 3. What is the key verse of the chapter? Keeping in mind, when we talk about living as a Christian, I think in our main theme, in our main outline of the book, while we're dealing with suffering, too, what's the main verse of the book, or of this chapter? Verse 16. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God
in this matter. And so you're not just suffering, you're suffering as a Christian. So we're talking again about living as Christians. And so as we get into this chapter, I mentioned a moment ago, there are 3 sections about what we need to do to live as Christians. 1 to 6, you put away your past life. 7 to 11, you live in light of the end of all things. 12 to 19, suffering as a Christian. So let's go to our first point. You put away your past life in 1 to 6. We're putting away the way that we once lived. There are 2 things he says about that. First of those, verse 1 and 2, therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same mind. And so you need to arm yourself with the mind of Christ, 1 and 2. That's part of putting away your past life. The first thing he points out in this section in 1 to 2 is looking to the example of Christ. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh. Now, as we talk about Christ suffering for us in the flesh, and we get into chapter 4, especially the way it's rendered in the New King James, there's a very important word at the very beginning of the chapter, and that is the word as much, or therefore, depending on your translation. And you've heard me before. When you see it, we need to go back. So let's set the background again. Where did we end on Wednesday? Well, we ended on Wednesday in verse 18. Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God by being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit. Verse 22, is gone into the heavens and is at the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him. So chapter 3 ended with Christ suffering. Why? For us. The just, or that word just there, some translations, the righteous for the unrighteous. And so keep this in mind as when we look to the example of Christ. The problem some of them may have been facing and questioning is, why are we suffering when we're trying to serve God? Why are we suffering for trying to be good people, to be holy people? Right? You go back to our outline we looked at earlier of the book, we titled 3:13 through chapter 4, Suffering for Being what? Holy. Right? Suffering for being a Christian. Why are we suffering? Well, he reminds them in chapter 3 to look to the example of Christ, who suffered the just for the unjust. As put in another passage, he made him who knew no sin to be sin. He suffered and bore the punishment for our sin so we could be saved. Look to that example. Yes.
Light or darkness is not like the light. And that's a principle, that's a concept that started. I mean, Cain killed Abel because Abel was accepted by God and Cain's sacrifice was not accepted by God. So this concept transcends almost the entirety of what we've done. And it's going to continue until Christ returns. Darkness is not like light. It doesn't comprehend lightness. And as a result of that, darkness would be the evil. It's not going to be complacent with just doing evil itself. It's going to go after the light. It's going to try to persecute, if you will, the light, the darkness. So this is something that's it's not a new concept.
And you're right, and I think as we get later on into this
Chapter as well, when we get into the main section on suffering at the end too, that's why he points out to him, don't think it's strange that you're going to suffer. Paul pointed out in 2 Timothy 3:12 that all who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. So he says, going back to verse 1, look to the example of Christ. But not just that, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same mind. ESV would say, with the same way of thinking, the Legacy Standard would use the phrase the same purpose. Now, what exactly is that? Well, put your marker here in 1 Peter, but then go over to Matthew 26 with me. Go to Matthew 26. You're not unfamiliar with this passage. When we go to Matthew 26, it will be very familiar to every one of us, but Matthew chapter 26, we're going to look at verse number 39. This is Jesus in the garden. Look at what he said. Oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Now, let's stop there. The cup of what? What's he facing? He's facing suffering, right? He's fixing to be put to death for our sins. He's going to be tried and scourged. All of that trial is fixing to take place. If possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. We need to have the mind of Christ in that we need to have the attitude that even if it requires suffering, that we're going to do what is the Lord's will. That's the mindset that we need. Not only that, look in verse 2, one who suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Now, I don't think he's saying at the end of verse 1, he's not talking about Jesus. How do I know that? Because he said the one that has suffered has ceased from sin. If he's talking about Jesus, Jesus having ceased from sin would imply that Jesus had sinned at some point. No, that's not true. Peter already dealt with that earlier in the book. Nor is he saying that we're perfect if we suffer. That's not fitting with other passages. I think the point is, the one who's suffering and why they're suffering is because they've made the decision to cease from sin. Doesn't mean they don't make mistakes. What it means is they've made the decision not to, as John would put it in 1 John 3, make a practice of sinning. And so one who's suffering, in this case, is suffering because they've ceased sin. Now, somebody may suffer while they're in sin, but that's not what we're talking about. These that are suffering because they've ceased from sin. They made the decision to serve Christ. Don't go back to that. There's something that he's going to remind them of in a minute. Yes?
The writer said in Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 8, though he was son, yet he learned obedience by the things that he suffered, okay? So Jesus suffered, we probably typically think that which would be right. You know, those things he endured even before being nailed to the cross, all we've been nailed to the cross. But he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And if we haven't eaten for a while, to me that kind of seems like a form of suffering. But Jesus didn't sin when the devil tempted him in those 3 different ways. So all these things, he learned obedience to the things which he suffered. And then, of course, the next verse says he became the source of eternal salvation to all that obey him. So there's the correlation. When we endure through suffering and not just try to evade it somehow, then that's going to build us to where we are obedient.
You're right, and that's something, as Peter pointed out
to them earlier in this book, that it was going to prove the genuineness of their faith when they suffered. Let's go to verse 2 now. That he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. Verse 2 further explains to me, I think, what the end of verse 1 means. Yes, 1 Peter 4. For he suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his life in the flesh. What does it mean to cease from sin? You're no longer living the rest of your life in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. That's what it means, verse 1. Cease from sin. You're striving to live for God. It doesn't mean you don't make mistakes. Here's an example of someone that made mistakes, but it means that when you do make them, you're going to deal with them. And the reason they're suffering is because they've made this decision to cease from sin. Which brings us to the next point in verse 3 through verse 6, which is we spend enough of time in doing the will of the Gentiles. Look at verse 3. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. So the point that Peter's making to them is, you've already spent enough time in trying to live for the flesh. I don't care how long one's done that. I don't care if one's done it for a short period of time or one lived a long life in the flesh and then obeyed the gospel. However long we've spent, it was long enough. It was too long in the flesh. And so you've got to put those things away. You spent enough of your life trying to live for the flesh. You spend enough of your life doing the will of the Gentiles. That needs to be put in the past. Yes.
The consistency of Paul writing, Romans 6:17, he says, "But God be thanked, that though ye were the servants of sin, you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine delivered you." So that's kind of the starting point of it all. You can't live the Christian life till you become a Christian. But Romans 6, Paul talks about crucifying the old man of sin and flesh or whatever like that. Okay, then you start this new pursuit of living that spiritual life. I believe it kind of brings out a lot, it makes in my mind a lot of the same thoughts that Peter's making here.
You're right, and I think, and again, it's a reminder there too. You've done it, you've changed, you need to keep changing. Like Romans chapter 6, can we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid, how shall we that died to sin live any longer therein? Let me jump ahead here for a second to a couple of questions over verses 3 and 4, and then we'll come back and discuss 3 and 4 in more detail. Question number 4. What should the world think of Christians according to 3 and 4? I'm looking at beginning of verse 4. They should think us what? Strange. Why don't you do the things that we do? Well, I guess that just answers the second part. What do we not engage in that leads to this thinking according to 3 and 4? Particularly verse 3. He gives us a specific list.
The worldly lust.
The worldly lust. Specifically listing lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. There's more than that to the list, obviously, of
Living for the flesh, but those specifically mentioned in this text. Let's go back to verse 3 now. The sins of the past lifetime. He said, you spent enough of doing the will of the Gentiles. Verse 3, when we walked in lewdness, King James Version, lasciviousness, ESV, sensuality. Older editions of the New King James would use the term licentiousness. The newer editions that most of us would have use the term lewdness. Lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties. The Geneva translation translates that by the term drinkings, is what the word drinking parties is translated and means, and abominable idolatries. So again, not an exhaustive list. You go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, you go to Romans chapter 1. There are other lists of sins. He's just using some of these as a representation for here's the kind of things you did, that you put away. And the time you spent in the past doing these things, that was enough. You spent enough time in doing these things in verse 3. That's why verse 4, the world thinks it's strange. Verse 4, in regard to these, that is, the things he's just listed, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. We use the term strange, and it's normally used in a negative sense, right? That person, somebody must say, that's something strange, or somebody's strange, or some event was strange, and we use it in a negative sense. As Christians, the world needs to think we're strange because we don't live like they do. In fact, he said in verse 4, they think it's strange you don't run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They don't just think you strange, they speak evil of you because you don't engage in the things they do. There may be, in their day and time, it may go beyond with persecution for some of these things, for being Christians, but in our day and time, there may be ridicule, poked fun at. They'll try to call you all sorts of names, but at the end of the day, to be servants of God, it's going to require the world to think us strange because we don't need to be participating in the things that the world is. Yes.
I think about St. Cornelius' inner circle, because we read prior to him being baptized into Jesus Christ, Cornelius gave alms, he prayed to God, he did a lot of those things. So once he obeyed the gospel, he wasn't a Christian until he did, but those things did go up to God. He prayed to God, to he seeked after God. So now you take Zacchaeus, that next door to more than he should from the Jewish people for the Roman government. That contrast from Zacchaeus, the people around him, especially when he went back and said, I'm going to restore this 4 times or whatever these things I took from you. That's going to be a big contrast. Not that both are important, I'm not minimizing that at all. But sometimes the people that maybe did the things outward that were seeming a lot more evil or like that, they're going to think this is really strange that this person, even the Apostle Paul, they wouldn't accept him early on. Why? Because he was formerly a persecutor and a blasphemer of Jesus Christ. So when he came there, this was just such a contrast or whatever. Probably a lot of the Jewish people thought, this is strange that this Saul of Tarsus is now professing the faith that he wants, bound people up to be persecuted and prosecuted both, I guess, Micah. So that contrast is going to seem stranger for some than what it is others.
And I think here, even with these, we have, as we said, I think we have a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles that Peter's writing to. Jews who may have been devout in the law, who now all of a sudden aren't observing the Passover and aren't observing these other things, but remembering the Lord's Supper, people may think, well, that's strange. The Gentiles who, these abominable idolatries, and that can be a number of things. Covetousness is idolatry, as Paul would point out. But going to these temples of idols and worshiping, and reality would be done in the name of idol worship and other things, and then to change from that, like those at Corinth, they're going to think it's strange because there was such a stark contrast. Verse 5 and 6, then, what he points out to him is, we will give an account to God, and that's why the gospel is preached. Look at verse 5. They, talking about those who think it strange and speak evil of you, will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Those that ridicule you, what's going to happen? They're ultimately going to give an account to God, according to verse 5. They're going to have to answer for the way they've conducted themselves, just like you're going to have to answer for the way you've conducted yourself. I think we come back more to that at the end of the chapter here. And I don't think we'll be able to get to that this morning, so Lord willing, on Wednesday we'll get to the end and discuss that more. But you'll stand in judgment. They'll stand in judgment. Verse 6, for this reason. What reason? They're going to give an account. For this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to the men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. And so the gospel message is being preached. You're preaching to those who are spiritually dead in hopes that they might change, and they may be judged by men in the flesh for what they've done, but they live according to God in the Spirit. They're going to give a good account, just like you can give that good account. Yes?
Another consistent between Peter's writing and Paul's writing in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul said, see, it is a righteous thing to pay with tribulation those that trouble you. Same thing he said right here. Those people may escape anything in this life as far as punishment goes for persecuting somebody that's a Christian. But it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those that trouble you. Paul makes the same point here.
You're right, Lord. I think we do.
More with that when we get to, like I said, the end of the chapter, talking about from our standpoint at least, that we can, in our giving of an account before God, we can be saved. And then what happens to the ungodly and the sinner? And we'll talk about that when we get to verse 18. But I do think that's, the kind of point he's driving home there in that section as well about giving an account. And we're saved and they're not. They're going to have to ultimately answer for the way they've conducted themselves. Let's get to 7 through 11 now. I'm going to spend a few minutes here. We already answered these questions. 7 through 11 now. Living in light of the end of all things. And so I want to take a few minutes here before we get into what he says about living in light of the end of all things, to do with a question that's raised. And the question that's raised is, what is the end of all things? And so if you're reading it the first time, you think, oh, well, that's the end of time. I think it is. I'll get to that more in a minute. There are a number of positions held by conservative Bible students who, concerning what exactly may be at reference, what's the end? And so some hold to the position that the end is the destruction of Jerusalem. If you recall our dating of the book, we're about 3 to 6 years. We're probably more about 64, 65. So we're about 5 or 6 years from the destruction of Jerusalem. There does seem to be a heavy Jewish influence in the book. So one thought is he's warning them, be careful how you conduct yourself. Destruction is going to be coming, the end in the sense of the Jewish system, and so that's going to be coming quickly. It might be, and I'll get more to that in a second. One position is that it's one's personal end. The end of you could be at hand. I think that one's a little less popular than the other two positions, though I think we'll come out to the same conclusion. And the third, and what I think it is the end of time. And here's the reason. I don't think it's the destruction of Jerusalem because, first and foremost, the recipients are not near Jerusalem. If you go back to chapter 1, remember in chapter 1, he's writing to those in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. We put that on a map. That's not really that close to Jerusalem. Also, there seems to be no other reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in the book. This is the only reference. Not that it can't be the only reference, but it almost just seems, if it is, that it comes out of nowhere. I think the stronger reason why I think it's the end of the end of time, is it's the end of all things. And as Peter would point out in 2 Peter, all these things will be dissolved. Now you may say, I think it's the destruction of Jerusalem. Fine. I don't think that's one of those things that affects whether or not we're going to be saved, because the end result we're going to come to is the same. And that is, whether you're facing sudden destruction, like when they're facing the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and persecution that's coming, you need to be serious and watchful in prayers. You need to have fervent love. You need to be hospitable, be a good steward, and speak as the oracles of God. If you're facing your end, that is, living in light of the end of your life, you need to be serious and watchful in prayers. You need to have fervent love. You need to be hospitable, be a good steward, and speak as the oracles of God. And if it's the end of time, you need to do those exact same things. And so, at the end of the day, you may say, you know what, I think it's the end of the destruction of Jerusalem, one's personal end. We're all going to come out to the same conclusion as to where we need to get. But I do think the reference here is living in light of the end of all things. By the way, even if you think it is the destruction of Jerusalem, the same principles can be taken and applied to the end of all things as well. Yes?
Hebrews 9:27, when a man once died and after the judgment. So if you're living in light of the judgment, it would bring out this point. And then you think the rich man in the heyday of the world where he's in torment, the end of all things is in hand for him. I believe he's just waiting there to get the final sentence to go into the bottomless pit and lay the fire. So all these things bring out that same concept. You know, that rich man wished he could have one more opportunity back and make life right. When he couldn't, well, he wished that his brothers would get this message or whatever. So all these things, and that rich man right now is in that heyday world, still suffering until the final judgment. And when you think about it from this light, it's scary, but it'll prompt us to fear God and keep His commandments.
You're right, and so again, that's why I said, no matter what position one takes on this, we come out to the same conclusion. One thing I want to answer real quick, and it'll be about all we have time for our time is up this morning. The question that gets raised, and one reason that people lean towards the destruction of Jerusalem, is the phrase "at hand," and say, well, what was at hand was the destruction of Jerusalem. As we said, it's about 5 or 6-ish years, give or take, away. The phrase "at hand" doesn't always mean imminent. In Romans chapter 13 and in verse 12, it says, "The night is far spent, the day is at hand." What's the day? Well, when you go back, our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. 11. He's talking about the final judgment, salvation in the sense of when we have the reward in heaven. James 5:8, Deuteronomy 32:35, and Hebrews 8:13 for other references are that phrase or some similar phrase is used. So the phrase "at hand" doesn't necessarily mean it's imminent, as in, are the days at hand, it's coming soon, but "at hand" can be used at times to refer to the fact that it's just closer, which is the point that Romans 13 is making. It's closer than when we first believed. You've heard me say this before. I don't know how long any of us are going to live, but I know that the day that we die is closer now than what it's ever been. I don't know when it's coming back, but that day is closer now than what it's ever been. The day is at hand. It could come at any moment, and so we need to live in light of the end of all things. Now, Lord willing, on Wednesday, we're going to pick up and continue looking at this section in more detail in terms of what it is we need to do to live in light of the end of all things. But I wanted to spend a moment to answer that question about what the end of all things is.
Every tear,